Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with a skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Please join us tomorrow at noon for a streaming-only program on the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum's Facebook page with journalist Jerry Mitchell, who will discuss his book, Race Against Time, which covers the reopening of 4 notorious civil rights cases: the assassination of Medgar Evers in Jackson, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner in Neshoba County, and the fatal firebombing of Vernon Damer Sr. in Hattiesburg. And then next week's History is Lunch program will feature Roy DeBerry, Aviva Futorian, John Lyons, and Joe Batts, whose new University Press of Mississippi book is titled Voices from the Mississippi Hill Country, the Benton County Civil Rights Movement. This program had to be postponed from late summer, and we're glad to have it. Today, we are happy to welcome back our old friend Richard Grant, who will discuss his new book on Natchez, The Deepest South of All. Richard Grant grew up in London, England. The Deepest South of All follows his previous best-selling book about Mississippi, Dispatches from Pluto, which was a New York Times bestseller and winner of the Pat Conroy Southern Book Prize. His other books are Crazy River, God's Middle Finger, and American Nomads. Now let's bring Richard in via Zoom.
Hello, Chris. Am I showing up on your screen?
I think we're live. Are we good? Yeah. All right. Richard, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be back, Chris.
You previously filled the historic House of Representatives chamber in the Old Capitol Museum for your first History's Lunch program on Dispatches from Pluto, which was a bestseller for months, really for years, here in Mississippi, and told the story of you and your wife relocating from New York City to the Mississippi Delta. How did you come to decide to write a second book about this state and on Natchez specifically?
Okay, so that book, Dispatches from Pluto, I was doing publicity for it, and I got invited up to the Hot Tamale Festival in Greenville, Mississippi. And on the opening night, they had this big gala event in a kind of refurbished cotton gin that was hung with chandeliers and laid out with gourmet food. And I got sat next to Regina Charbonneau, who is from Natchez and is a chef and a cookbook writer. I got talking to her and her husband, who was distilling rum in Natchez, and they said, well, you must come down. You can stay in our antebellum home. And Regina says, I've got a restaurant that's in a building that was built in the 1790s. She said, there's always a party, I'll cook for you. And she's a friend of the Rolling Stones. And she said she'd tell me some stories about the Rolling Stones. And I said, yes, this was an invitation not to refuse. And at that time, I really didn't know anything at all about Natchez. I'd vaguely heard of it from a Howlin' Wolf song. But, I drove down there from Pluto. And the first thing that struck me was I pull over for historical markers. I don't know about you, but I always pull over for historical markers. And I was just sort of coming into Natchez, and I saw this historical marker, and I pulled over and then found out I was standing on the site of what had been the second largest slave market in the South, the Forks of the Road. And that was sort of kind of a very powerful introduction to Natchez. I spent about half an hour looking at the placards and signs on this very small monument, and I learned about people getting marched all the way from Maryland to Natchez in manacles and chains. And it was kind of, it was a very kind of upsetting introduction to Natchez. And I had all that kind of floating around in my head. And then I went to Regina's restaurant and did a book event there, and I was struck by how many gay people were there and how easily and naturally they were accepted by everybody. And then I found out that Natchez had just elected a gay black mayor, which obviously is unusual in Mississippi. And then all this different stuff is sort of floating around in my head. And then that evening, Regina said, "Oh, did you bring a suit and tie?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, spruce yourself up as best we can. There's a party tonight at Stanton Hall." And Stanton Hall, you've probably been there. It's this gigantic antebellum mansion that takes up an entire block of downtown Natchez,
Right.
and is preserved as a kind of time capsule on the eve of the Civil War. And this party was it was a kind of annual party that the Pilgrimage Garden Club has every year. And I was just really intrigued by these kind of dowagers, these grandes dames of the Pilgrimage Garden Club, sort of holding court at this party, and younger women coming up to pay court to the elder women, seeking favors. And then I found out there was 2 garden clubs, and they'd been feuding since 1935. And sometime that evening, I decided that there was a book to be written about Natchez. So I would say within 4 hours of being there, I decided that I wanted to write about this place.
Yeah. Natchez can have that effect on one for sure. And even if you grew up in Mississippi, you may not have experienced anything like Natchez until you've been to Natchez.
Yeah, and then I was talking to other people about Natchez, and then I was mentioned that I was interested in Natchez to someone from Vicksburg, and then I found out that
right.
Natchez was not very popular in Vicksburg. So there's only one thing you need to know about Natchez: they surrendered twice.
That's right. Bagum.
Yeah, but that's interesting too. That this was a town with a strong pro-union history.
Right.
They voted not to secede. A lot of the kind of leading citizens were unionists. It had a unionist newspaper during the Civil War,
right,
during the run-up to the Civil War, and and did surrender twice.
Right, successfully so. So you decided that there was a story there. You've talked before about the research that you do to prepare for your writing projects, which can mean reading several books about a topic just before writing a magazine article, much less a book. So what were some of the books that you read about Natchez to prepare for this book, and what are some of the things that stuck with you from them?
Yeah, I've got some of them on my desk here. So I think the first book I read was Natchez on the Mississippi by Harnett Kane, which is an entertaining volume, but he's prone to exaggerate and sometimes to... Well, I imagine that most of the stories that he put in there he did here, but it's not clear whether he exaggerated or whether the people telling him the stories exaggerated, but entertaining nonetheless, and very enjoyable read. And it's funny you should mention Jerry Mitchell's book, Race Against Time, because here's another book called Race Against Culture and Separation in Natchez since 1930. I found this a very good book, a useful book. Now, I had not read much about slavery until really that first day when I showed up in Natchez and started walking around the forks of the road. I realized that I'd been kind of avoiding reading about that subject just because it's so upsetting. But once I made the decision to write about Natchez, which was a town that was essentially built on slavery, both on the sale and purchase of people and their exploitation in cotton fields, I decided that it was time to educate myself about slavery. And a few of the books here, I mean, I really liked 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, pretty essential reading. Here is Inhuman Bondage by David Bryan Davis. I wanted to kind of get a sense of American slavery compared to slavery systems in South America and the Caribbean.
Right.
And then I really enjoyed this Roll, Jordan, Roll by Eugene Genovese. I think it's quite a controversial book now, because he takes seriously the idea that paternalism existed.
Right.
And a lot of the book is about how enslaved people exploited paternalism in order to secure as much as they could from. They would use the idea of paternalism kind of against the slave owners in order to get rights, in order to get as much as they can. And there's a lot in that book about that kind of fraught relationship around paternalism. He's also a Marxist. But anyway, I enjoyed that one. And then Edward Baptiste, The Half Has Never Been Told. It's kind of the latest big book on slavery. I thought he maybe overstated his case a bit, but nonetheless, essential reading, I think.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about Natchez, because he talks a lot about that forced migration of slaves from Maryland and Virginia down to this new cotton frontier, which Natchez was kind of the capital.
Right.
He talks about the new sort of whip that was invented and the kind of very systematic extraction of labor by cruelty that evolved on plantations around Natchez. Another very powerful and upsetting book. I mean, I've probably got 50 books here sitting on my desk that I read. The Goat Castle Murder book.
That's a great one.
That's a great book. Another weird Natchez story that we'll maybe get into later.
Yeah.
And I think the best book that I read was Prince Among Slaves by Terry Alford. The true story of an African prince sold into slavery in the American South. And this became a kind of key book for me when I wrote my book, because I used the story of this enslaved prince as a kind of thread running through my book.
Right. Well, so Natchez is the oldest European settlement on the Mississippi River. It takes its name from the Native Americans who lived in the area when it was established. The town once had the most millionaires per capita in the United States. Today has the greatest concentration of antebellum mansions in the South. You noted the town's culture of contradictions with this quote: Natchez was a Union town, but its wealth was built on cotton and slavery. To this day, prominent white families dress up in hoopskirts and Confederate uniforms for celebrations of the Old South, yet Natchez is also progressive enough to have elected a gay black man for mayor with 91% of the vote. That really gets to the heart of what you write about in the deepest South of all. Tell us a little bit about what you found once you spent some time in Natchez.
Well, I was just... I didn't really have a systematic approach, Regina Charbonneau put me up in her home in Twin Oaks, which was, this glorious antebellum home. And she kind of gave me the upstairs rooms, and she enjoyed telling people, yes, we keep an Englishman in the attic. And so Regina at that time was president of the Pilgrimage Garden Club. So I had this kind of ringside seat on the kind of feuding dramas and attempts to come together between the two garden clubs as they put on this event called the Historic Natchez Tableau, which does involve dressing up in hoopskirts and Confederate uniforms. Also involves live dogs and little children dancing around the maypole. And well, I was there, not for the first time, but they were trying to find a way to include, it celebrates Natchez history. And for years, they completely erased black history and omitted any references to slavery. Before that, they'd had happy slaves eating watermelons and singing Negro spirituals in front of fake cotton fields. But anyway, when I got there, they were trying to find a way to gracefully incorporate some African-American history into this tableau. So I wrote a lot about that process, which is ultimately I decided it was a kind of a doomed effort. You just cannot address slavery with cute little girls in dresses dancing around a maypole in the same production. It just kind of it's very jarring. I found.
Yeah. But
there was also sort of moments of high comedy and awfulness backstage because the production just kept going horribly wrong. It was kind of fraught with technical glitches. And have you ever seen that Christopher Guest movie about the amateur theatrical? What's it called? Waiting for Guffman.
Yes.
Yeah, there was kind of elements of Waiting for Guffman there, with Confederate uniforms thrown in.
So for people who don't know, Natchez is not a huge place. So
No, it's barely 15,000 people and shrinking.
And yet 2 garden clubs.
2 garden clubs, yeah. So there was originally 1 garden club, and the garden club came up with the brilliant idea of opening up all these antebellum homes and getting tourists to pay money to tour them. This was the Natchez pilgrimage, which began in the 1930s. And then this historic Natchez tableau, this celebration of Natchez history, was a way to entertain the tourists in the evening and bring in some more money. And the garden club came to a powerful disagreement over money. And one faction broke off from the Natchez Garden Club and formed the Pilgrimage Garden Club, known as the Pills to the other club. Anyway, so this feuding began in the 1930s, but and it kind of flared up quite badly again while I was there. So I wrote something about that.
But the two clubs are not entirely separate. They work together on the tableau.
They work together on the tableau, yeah. But they've also in the past have sabotaged each other. There's a story that one club likes to tell. One part of the tableau is that live hound dogs come out on the stage. It's called the hunt scene.
Right.
And then soon after the hunt scene, the king and queen of the garden club make their grand entrance, and she's wearing like a flowing gown, and he's in a Confederate officer's uniform. And one year, one club fed laxatives to the hounds, so that the king and queen of the opposing club would have to kind of pick their way through dog excrement on the stage. Yeah. Now I think one club has pulled out of the tableau completely.
Yeah, yeah. The justification for the existence of the tableau and for the pilgrimage has been that those groups help keep up all those antebellum mansions that we talked about, the highest concentration in the South, and that participation in the tableau is sort of an incentive for its members.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's a very intricate system that was designed by these garden club women in the 30s. So to keep up the point of the essential point of the garden clubs is, as you say, to preserve and keep up the antebellum buildings in Natchez. To do that requires lots and lots of volunteer hours, right. Mainly from women. And to incentivize this volunteering, the more hours that you volunteer for the garden club, the better roles your children get in the historic tableau. So that's been the incentive. So if you were to scrap the tableau, as a lot of people think would be a good idea, that you would remove that incentive, and probably the whole system would kind of start to fall apart.
Right. So what are some of those roles that people play in the tableau?
Oh, goodness. I've been busily erasing this from my memory banks, but I mean, there's the king and the queen are up here, and then there's pages, and then there's all these different dances. There's Jefferson Davis's wedding. I think you get points if you get to be in the wedding scene. It's an elaborate system that I'm not remembering clearly.
But a tremendous honor for locals to be named the king, the queen.
Absolutely, yeah. And
a generational aspiration.
One of the other things that struck me on my first evening in Natchez was Regina and Doug took me back to Twin Oaks, and I was kind of like left alone in the house. Regina said, "If you look around," and she was getting dressed for the ball. And you know, Regina's, like I said, she's friends with the Rolling Stones. She had like a very fashionable club in San Francisco. She's very worldly, appeared to be sort of quite sophisticated and liberal. And I sort of came around one corner of her house, and there was this huge oil painting of a young man in a Confederate uniform, and I was like really puzzled. And then her African-American housekeeper said, "Oh, that's Regina's son." And I said, "Well," he said he was king of the pilgrimage. I had no idea what this all meant. But yeah, if your son is king or your daughter is queen, it's the custom is to get these oil portraits done, and you see them hanging in a lot of the antebellum homes there.
And for decades, the tableaus were primarily segregated. It was only white people who participated in the tableau.
Yes, yes, and it was I think yeah, for decades. I think it was Greg Iles, the novelist who lives in Natchez, who I had the pleasure of getting to know down there.
So Natchez's most famous son at the moment, yeah.
Yes, yes. So his daughter Madeline was made queen, and she was kind of attending Millsaps College at the time, and she just couldn't go through with the fact that there were no black performers, the fact that African American history was being completely ignored. And I think she kind of used it as a little bit of leverage. And then, you know, her dad, Greg Iles, offered to bring the production up to date and include African American history and African American performers. And that had just happened a few years before I got there. I think 2 or 3 years before I got there.
So you get a New York Times best-selling author offering to do some script work for you, and they.
I mean, and it's a lot of work. He didn't just write the script; he kind of managed the whole production. And
right, supported it in various ways. And so, how did that play out?
Well, I mean, the way that I heard it, the first year was kind of quite an uplifting experience for a lot of the people involved. The second year, it kind of turned more sour, according to what Madeline Iles told me, and I think Greg as well. That the forces of what would you call it? I guess racism would be as useful a word as any. But that people started being cold towards the black performers. There was some unpleasant things said. That the kind of feeling that everyone had of coming together in the first year was not there the second year in the same way. I think Madeline Iles found it very disheartening. I think Greg did too. I mean, basically, a fair amount of white people in Natchez just wanted the traditional tableau. They wanted it all white. They wanted the thing that they remembered from previous, you know, decades and generations. They wanted what they thought was the proper tableau back. And having African American performers and having slavery in there was just it was very unpopular with a section of the white community there.
So one of the strong strains throughout your book is the difficulty that folks in Natchez today, black and white, face in the discussion of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, you know, when I first got to Natchez, I was just struck by its uniqueness. You know, it didn't remind me of anywhere else that I'd been. It seemed very, very different to the rest of Mississippi and had some similarities with New Orleans, maybe. But the more time I got to spend there, and the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Natchez was kind of a microcosm of America when it came to the issues of race and slavery. You know, as a nation, has become more clear in the last year or so. America's never really dealt with what slavery has done to it. Never really dealt with the legacy of slavery. It's preferred to deny and mythologize. And but when I got to Natchez, it's impossible to ignore the influence of slavery there because of all the antebellum mentions, because of the slave market, because
Right.
there's a restaurant that's housed in a 28-foot tall Mammy statue. Mammy's covered. And I felt that Natchez, I was there, 4 years ago? So it's before the Black Lives Matter movement, before the New York Times project, the 1619, was it?
Yeah.
Before all that here in Natchez, that people were really making an effort to talk about these things that were still not being talked about at the national level, that there had been serious discussions for many years about how to incorporate the history of slavery into the tourism experience in Natchez. It just kept coming up. I mean, you hear a lot. I heard a lot of talk about slavery and its legacy in Natchez that 4 years ago that I hadn't heard in the rest of the country at that point. And I think Natchez was kind of doing work then that needs to get done on a national level. And it's hard work. There's no easy solutions, but I mean, I heard a lot of sort of honest, intelligent, heartfelt discussion about race and slavery in Natchez.
Yeah, and you talk about in your book several individuals. Specifically, I'm thinking of native son Clifford Boxley, who took the name Serse Alhater, and has been really responsible for bringing to prominence locally and then at a statewide level and now nationally the Forks of the Road site, the history there that really had just been totally ignored for decades.
Yeah, it's an odd thing in Natchez. You got this small town that's obsessed with its own history and kind of sunk in the past in a lot of ways, and yet it managed to. Most black people and like nearly all white people had lost track of the fact that there was this second largest slave market in the South. Was there, right now there was like a car wash there and like a muffler shop, and it was really Sir Boxley more than anybody else who fought and battled and stuck to his guns and got this place, A, recognized, B, partially preserved. I think the National Park Service is going to take it over now.
That's right.
Correct? Yeah. But if he hadn't been so dogged, nothing. There could be nothing there. I mean, there's nothing in New Orleans to really commemorate. What is it, Maspero's?
Yeah.
The biggest. I mean, they were selling slaves all over New Orleans, but there's nothing that really commemorates that in New Orleans. At least last time I checked.
There's a really moving story that you tell about the United States colored troops who, when they were in Natchez, were given the assignment of stationing there at the Forks of the Road site and what they did and how they went about doing it. Yeah,
I mean, they were stationed there at the Forks of the Road, and then they got the order to rip down all the slave pens, and some of the colored troops had been enslaved inside those pens, and no doubt mistreated, and apparently with great gusto and excitement and joy, they set about smashing that thing to the ground.
Throughout the night, stayed up throughout.
That's one of the things that Greg Iles did, is he put that scene into the tableau.
Yeah, and one of the powerful things I think in the book is your description of sort of the banality of slave sales, almost like buying a car.
Yeah, there was no at the Forks of the Road. There was no auction system. as there had been in other parts of Natchez, as was typical. There was there was kind of a set price, and the finance. Most people had to finance the sale, and you would go and inspect the merchandise and come to an agreement and sign a note, and I mean it was kind of like buying a car or something.
Yeah, I mean an installment plan.
Yeah, you put some money down, and you paid a note on the rest of it. Except it was a human being.
Right. So the book is organized into chapters, of course, and the chapters alternate between two stories: the story of contemporary Natchez, sort of what we've been talking about, but then also the saga of Abd al-Rahman Ibrahima, an enslaved prince from what is now Guinea, and one of the most nationally, internationally known figures to pass through the Forks of the Road site there. Can you tell us the story of Prince Ibrahima?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that I told it in the book, I started out with this this Irish doctor called John Cox, who went ashore in West Africa. I forget the year. I think 1700 and something. And he became separated from his companions, and they were hunting, as I remember it. And then they went back on the ship and sailed away. And he, I think, got heat stroke, and he got like got bitten by insects, and he was found. This young Irish doctor, one-eyed, John Cox, was found by some warriors from the Fulani people, and they took him back to their capital and nursed him back to health. And he became friendly with the king and the king's son, whose name was Ibrahima, or Abdul Rahman Ibrahima. And then I think may have fathered a child with Ibrahima's sister. And then eventually John Cox decides that he's got to get back to Ireland. And they march him down to the coast, and they actually find him they put him on the same ship that he arrived on by coincidence. And then John Cox sails away. And Ibrahima becomes commander of the kingdom's army. And he leads this military expedition to basically punish enemies that have been interfering with the Fulani trade in gold and in slaves.
All right.
And he makes a bad miscalculation, and he gets captured. And then he gets marched over to the Gambia River, and he gets taken down the Gambia River, and he gets sold into slavery. He crosses the Atlantic, endures the hell of the Middle Passage, gets to New Orleans, and then he gets sold again and taken upriver to Natchez. When he comes into Natchez, it was just a small place then, still under Spanish rule. Excuse me. A young man who's exactly the same age as Ibrahima, named Thomas Foster, buys him and leads Ibrahima away to his plantation behind his horse. And, Ibrahima is a very well-educated man. He speaks 5 languages. He's been to university in Timbuktu. He knows mathematics and astronomy. He's the commander of his kingdom's military. He's his father's favored son. He's basically groomed to be king. He's drug away behind a horse to this muddy little fields outside Natchez, and he refuses to work, and he refuses to demean himself by working in the fields. Thomas Foster reaches for the whip, which is supposed to solve problems like this, but it just stiffens Ibrahima's resistance. And so these 2 young men are kind of at a standoff, and Ibrahima runs off, escapes into the woods, and then realizes that he can't survive, and goes back, and ragged, hungry, wild-eyed, and basically submits himself. He lays down before Thomas Foster's wife and places her foot on his throat, which is a West African gesture of submission. And after that, Ibrahima is kind of obedient, does everything Foster wants him to, and never ever smiles. He was famous for never smiling. And in time, Foster puts him in charge as a kind of a driver of his slaves and of his plantation. And Ibrahima, being a kind of natural leader of men and a very smart, well-educated person, gets this plantation running really, really well. It piles up wealth for Thomas Foster and his kids. And then I think Ibrahim had been there well over 30 years and was getting old and didn't have to do as much work. I mean, he was allowed to sell vegetables at a market, local market. He's taking his vegetables there to market, and who should he see but John Cox, the Irish doctor. They haven't seen each other since Cox sailed away on that ship in West Africa, in what's now Guinea, and they had this kind of rapturous embrace. Ibrahim smiles for the first time since he's been there. And then Cox tries to get him freed. He said, "Look, this man treated me like his own family when I was in Fouta Djallon, and this is the prince. This is the Prince of Fouta Djallon. We must get this man freed immediately and return to Africa." But Thomas Foster refuses to sell because Ibrahim is invaluable to him on the plantation. Plus, Foster is kind of a stubborn old cuss. As well, but eventually Ibrahima's case reaches the White House, and John Quincy Adams, the president, instructs Thomas Foster that this man needs to be freed and will be returned to Africa, and Foster agrees. And then Ibrahima, having been, a military commander, having been a slave, now becomes an American celebrity, and that he gets decked out in this peculiar costume. He gets dressed up like a circus Arab, and he goes on this fundraising tour of the Northeast, and this costumed fundraising tour because he's got children that are still enslaved to Foster, and he wants to buy his children out of slavery and take them to Africa with him.
Right. He's dealing even with the United States president and inviting him to contribute to the cause.
Yeah. He asked John Quincy Adams to give money, and he visited the White House in his costume and made the rounds of dignitaries. I think he went to sort of 6 different cities and became so famous that he spawned imposters. That there was other people started dressing up in strange costumes and demanding money to get back to their homelands and exotic places, but they were exposed as frauds.
But not before raising significant amounts of money.
Yeah. But anyway, Ibrahima and his American wife did end up going back to Africa. But he never quite made it back to his homeland. He died of dysentery, I think it was, or fever. In Liberia. But I kind of tied the story up in the book because I met descendants of his in Natchez.
Right.
In fact, a woman named Beverly Adams, a wonderful woman, she's descended both from Ibrahima and also from the Fosters, who were known as the rapist Fosters in her family. And she just found out quite recently that she had African royalty in her blood, as well as, Foster blood. So that was a kind of difficult thing to come to grips with her. But another thing I wrote about in the book that Beverly Adams and Nan Foster Shoes, who is a Foster descendant, they have become friends, and they do a presentation for tourists on on the story of Ibrahima and the Fosters, which I applaud.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a fascinating part of how it has all developed.
Just one more thing about
Yeah.
this Ibrahima story. So, in the book I put it in the present tense, and
Hmm.
I chose to do that. My own experiences in contemporary Natchez I wrote about in the past tense, but people ask me, like, why did you put Ibrahima in the present tense? And it was a few different reasons. One, vividness. The present tense is more vivid, and I wanted to make the story as vivid as possible. But I also just wanted to suggest something about Natchez, that often the past seems more vivid there than the present. The present sometimes feels like an afterthought
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Natchez.
yeah, absolutely. So his story, one of the most well known, in just a few years after the story of William Johnson sort of picks up and is significant because of the journal that he kept that is one of the best windows into everyday life in Natchez, which was one of the had one of the highest populations of free black citizens in Mississippi and in the South. Can you tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about William Johnson?
Yeah, William Johnson. Um, so he had a white father who freed his mother and freed William, his son. This was particularly common in Natchez. I mean, obviously that there was a lot of interracial sex in the Old South. What was unusual about Natchez and also New Orleans was that it was much more common to have lasting, long-term relationships between white men and black women, and that these were much more socially accepted in Natchez, certainly than the rest of Mississippi, probably more accepted in Natchez than anywhere else
Yeah.
apart from New Orleans. And this gave rise to this class of free people of color, free blacks, who were not free exactly.
Right.
They were kind of occupied this tenuous middle ground between the freedom that whites enjoyed and the enslavement that most blacks were suffering under. They had to carry passes and be basically watch themselves. They didn't have that many avenues of employment open. One of them was barbering, and William Thompson became a barber and an entrepreneur. He ended up owning several barber shops in Natchez, and he also became friendly with a lot of the most prominent white citizens. Started out probably cutting their hair and trimming their beards, but they would go to the horse races together. He became very friendly with Adam Bingaman, who was a very notable citizen, had been to Harvard, had a political career in Mississippi. Him and William Johnson became very close friends. And Adam Bingaman had a long-term mistress whose name I'm forgetting, but anyway, their children became close with William Johnson's family because, these white aristocrats just kept producing, mixed blood children, and William Johnson would find professions and spouses for these children. And yeah, Bingaman and Johnson were at the kind of heart of this separate community inside Natchez, which was sort of sympathetic whites, mixed race couples, and free blacks. Yeah, it's an unusual story in the South. Really, only, like I say, Natchez and New Orleans had it to the same extent.
And because of the significance, because of the length of time that Johnson kept his diary, the federal government operates a museum at his house. Folks can go and see it, and it's really an amazing thing to have.
Yeah.
But in the midst of 100 amazing things that still exist in Natchez.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people say, well, why would you want to write a book about a little town in Mississippi? I mean,
Right.
there is so much there.
Yeah, it's stacked deep. So
Yeah, I mean the Johnson's diary. I mean, I forget how long he kept. I mean, I have it here. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
it's a fat thing, you know.
right, right.
And yeah, he just records. I mean, it's parts of it are really dull, and parts
Yeah,
of it
not
are
a lot of
frustrating.
poetry in it. It's the sort of stuff that's significant for historians and for
Yeah, I
understanding.
mean,
Yeah,
he never says that. I mean, for me, the most frustrating thing, because he was freed from enslavement by
right.
his white father. He never tells you what he thinks of his father in the diary, nor does he tell you much. Well, Johnson owned slaves of varying numbers throughout his life, but he owned slaves, and he tried to teach them how to read and write, but he also had no compunction at all about whipping them. But he never tells you what he thinks about slavery. He just seems to take it for granted as the way things are. But it was he
Yeah.
must have had he must have had he must have had feelings about slavery, having being born into it and then having slaves himself. But he was not a reflective man.
But still, a poignant story with him and the enslaved man that he wound up selling.
Yeah, no, it's one slave. Yeah, he did anguish over Stephen, who was William Johnson liked Stephen, but Stephen was an alcoholic and would go off on binges and get into trouble, and thereby threaten William Johnson's freedom. He could have had his freedom revoked for failure to control his slaves properly.
Yeah.
So Johnson came to the decision to sell Stephen down the river. And the first time he couldn't go through with it. He didn't have the heart to do it. And then finally he had this. He went down to the river and sold Stephen. And I think was quite anguished about it.
So you talked about the intermixing white families, black families. One of the people that you interviewed in your book is someone I admire, a former member of the Board of Trustees for the Department of Archives and History, Mr. Duncan Morgan. And one of the things that's said about him is that he's equally able to move about white society, black society, has long familial connections to both. What were some of the things that he talked with you about?
Yeah, Duncan Morgan, an amazing person. Duncan Morgan is this. Well, he's a master bricklayer that's
Right.
worked on nearly all of the antebellum homes there. I think he's much in demand and booked up. But he's also a kind of walking encyclopedia of Natchez history. And under normal, we would probably call him African American, but he calls himself mixed.
Yeah.
Since he is mixed, which is what he would be called in Britain, where I'm from.
Yeah.
America has its own system for defining who's black or who's African American. But yeah, he calls himself mixed, and he was talked a lot about, which kind of ties into this what we were talking about, the free black community there. That there was a social space for people of mixed blood, that they were kind of more accepted by white society than they would have been in the rest of Mississippi.
Right.
Because and part of it is because a lot of them, Duncan's related to a lot of the kind of the old white aristocratic families in Natchez, and I think in a sense he has some pride about that.
Right.
He was talking about how Natchez changed when the factories came in the 1940s and 1950s. That it became a lot more difficult to be a mixed person or in a mixed blood marriage, because you had a different group coming in to work these factory jobs, so mainly Scotch-Irish, not very well educated, and had a much kind of angrier, more hateful form of racism than the kind of old white Natchez money. It was a different type of racism. and it was more aggressive. And so a lot of mixed race couples kind of kept it quiet after the 1940s and 50s. But he said they would often go up north to get married and then come back down. But it wasn't as out in the open as it had been. He also, I asked him in the interview, he said, we've been talking about all these white men and black women and that influence on Natchez. I said, did it ever happen the other way around with black men and white women? And he said, look, like most white people don't know this, but yes, it did. He said that white women would get jealous of their husbands having affairs with, enslaved black women in their household, and they would have revenge affairs. They would usually pick the kind of lighter skinned black man, and then if they got pregnant, the usual thing was to go on a shopping trip to Europe and either come back without the baby or come back with the baby, and some story about your poor cousin in Spain or Sicily couldn't look after this child.
The swarthy Spaniards, yes.
And then when they got back to Natchez, the white people would kind of forget in a generation or so that the story was right. Nonsense. But among the black people, the real story persisted and came down through the generations. And Duncan Morgan remembers hearing all these stories when he was young from his father, and I think maybe his grandfather.
Yeah. Well, that leads us into sort of the civil rights era, which in Natchez was both volatile and organized in some aspects of it. I mean, there were certainly murders, there were fire bombings and bombings, but there was an organized boycott and a group organized, eschewing the nonviolent principles espoused by some of the leaders of the civil rights movement, taking the model from Louisiana and the Deacons for Defense. And you were able to interview Mr. Stokes, one of the Deacons for Defense.
Yeah. That was a real honor for me, because the Deacons for Defense, they were kind of like an armed paramilitary group who decided that nonviolent protest was not for them. A lot of them were World War II vets and proud American gun owners. Yeah, and they decided that the kind of the real foundation for the enforcement of white supremacy in that part of Mississippi and also in Louisiana was the Klan. The Klan. Right. The Klan were committing atrocities left and right. The Klan had thoroughly infiltrated law enforcement, and it was the intimidation of the Klan was the main obstacle to making progress on civil rights. So they decided to arm themselves and take the fight to the Klan, and they did succeed in basically backing down the Klan to an extent. And so what happened in Natchez was you had an organized boycott of the white-owned stores downtown, and then you had the Deacons for Defense cruising around armed, openly armed, and anybody that came into black neighborhoods to cause trouble, they would confront. They also were spying on the Klan. There were a lot of Klansmen working in the factories alongside the Deacons. And it proved to be very effective, this combination of armed self-defense and the boycott. And the city of Natchez basically agreed to nearly all the civil rights demands. And yeah, it was a model of civil rights that proved very, very effective. Yeah. The rest of Mississippi, I mean, it took the feds, right?
Yeah. Well, and with sharp elbows amongst the Deacons as well, who realized the importance of encouraging African Americans to abide by the shopping ban.
Yeah. So I interviewed James Stokes, who was one of the leaders. He was elderly, and when I met him at his house, but yeah, it was just a real privilege to get to know him. And I also, at the end of the interview, I said, well, when did you all disband, And he said, well, what do you mean? It's like, we had a meeting last week. they're still meeting.
We're sort of coming up on the end of the hour, but we would be remiss if we did not hit a lick at some of the characters from Natchez history. So you take your pick of what you want to say a few words about here. Nellie Jackson.
Well, I think
Goat Castle murders.
I think Nellie Jackson really speaks volumes about Natchez. Here is, Nellie, Miss Nellie, as most people call her, was a black woman who ran a brothel in the middle of Natchez for 60 years?
Yeah.
I think 60 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was friends with the chief of police and the mayor. And I mean, you find me another town in Mississippi where a black woman gets to operate a brothel for 60 years.
Right.
I mean, Natchez is very tolerant in a lot of ways, especially regarding sexuality. It's like very tolerant of homosexuality. It's apparently very tolerant of, quote, vice. Maybe because it was a river town.
Yeah.
So my friend Regina Charbonneau, she grew up a block away from Nellie Jackson's house. And, Nellie would drive by in her long white Cadillac with a white poodle in her lap and a fur coat and a pistol. And she was on great terms with Regina, and they became friends. And when Regina was little, she would go trick-or-treating at Nellie Jackson's house. And it was great because Nellie would give you a roll of quarters. It wasn't candy. Nellie would give you cash on the barrelhead. Right. I said, Regina, so your parents didn't mind you trick-or-treating at a whorehouse? And she said, no, they didn't mind it. But on Sundays when we went to church, we had to walk 3 blocks to avoid walking past Nellie's house on the way to church.
Right.
And then, of course, she came to a horrible kind of Faulknerian ending that she turned away a young man who was drunk from her house, and he came back with gasoline and threw the gasoline on her, but spilled it on himself and lit them both on fire and burned down, or at least damaged the house, and then they both died of their burn wounds.
Right. Age 87, I think, was,
Yeah. That's the ending that Faulkner would have written, right?
Yeah, right. Maybe we should say a word about, of all the left, right, up, down divisions in Natchez, the high society atop the bluffs, and there's still remnants of the infamous Under the Hill as well, which was where the riverboat crews would pass their time in gentle ways. I think the quote was, "The only thing cheaper than the body of a woman was the life of a man."
Yeah. Natchez Under the Hill was there was a kind of informal contest going in the early 1800s, and what was like the most sinful, wicked place on the Mississippi River? Was it Memphis? Was it St. Louis? Was it New Orleans? But the people who decided these things, who were, riverboat gamblers and roustabouts, they all agreed that Natchez Under the Hill was like the roughest, wickedest spot on the river. And, you had these kind of, on the bluff above the river, you had this kind of life of colonnaded elegance, and then you kind of came down Silver Street, down to the waterfront,
right.
And there was just these gambling halls and brothels and saloons and fights and eye gougings, and like people getting their ears bitten off for sport, and rough and tumble wrestling and riverboat gamblers, and just a hell's broth down there under the hill. And
still the spot that some of the parties and parades wind up at the conclusion.
There's a great little tavern down there now. I think it's survives from the old days.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The Under the Hill Saloon. Under Hill Saloon. Yeah,
I think that's right.
Which is it's a great bar, and I remember one evening we were all in black ties and ball gowns. We'd been to some garden club ball at Stanton Hall, and then much as the aristocrats had done back in the day, we went down under the hill to roister in the saloon.
Yeah.
It was a kind of old migration path in Natchez.
Well, it's a fascinating look into several hundred years of Natchez history. I don't know whether to feel sorry for you or glad for you, or if it's just pure coincidence that the Natchez Literary and Cinema Celebration probably will be virtual only this year and prevent you from returning to the town after the publication of the book. But we thank you for being with us today. Thanks for this exploration of what you've talked about. In the book, we'll have signed copies of it for sale here through the Mississippi Museum store. We'll put information about how to purchase those in the comments section. Richard, thank you so much. We look forward to what you do in the future, and thank you for what you've done so far.
All right. It's great to be on again, Chris.
Yes, indeed.
I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Richard. We'll see you. Thank you all for watching.